I have met recently, and quite frankly, on and off throughout my life, but specifically recently, a guy who was desperately trying to become rich. His goal was to do it by any means necessary. He didn't really like that I was pursuing financial ethics. He thought that that meant that I was trying to create barriers to him gaining wealth. I didn't feel that way at all. I want to make something really as clear as I know how to make it, and so I'm just going to try to get across the statistics. The kind of wealth inequality that currently is going on in the world is so vast in how big of a difference it is between the poorest people in the world and the richest that it's almost immeasurable for our ability to comprehend it. The richest people in the world hold trillions of dollars in combined wealth just in the 0.1% of people, just in the 0.01% of people. And we talk about the 1%, but the 1% can include someone who has say $12 billion. And then you look at people who have hundreds of billions of dollars. Meanwhile, there are some people on the face of the earth who live on less than $2 a month. You can say, oh, well, I want to be rich. There's nothing necessarily wrong with that. But being rich to the degree that the richest are rich is not something that is likely to be obtainable for you ever. And so your idea of rich is probably not the same concept as the idea of how rich the richest people are. They gained 63% of all wealth generated, period, during the pandemic. The top 1% of all income earners. Meanwhile, 4 billion almost people are living in poverty. 1.7 billion people are living just in countries where inflation is outpacing their ability to gain traction on their own poverty. They cannot earn enough wages. It is not possible for them to get out of the poverty. We have starvation going on the face of the planet, while we have other people who have more of a quote-unquote worth than countries. The combined wealth of the 1% is more than the entire wealth of the entire continent of Africa. The entirety of the wealth of the richest people is so astronomically huge that it's not comparable with someone who's, say, wanting to earn like $200,000 a year, or $250,000 a year, or $300,000 a year, heck, $400,000 a year. In order to get into the top 1%, you would have to earn like $600,000 or more a year. And even then, you'll be at the very bottom of the top 1%. They earn so much money so quickly, it's not comprehensible for an average person to understand. The average person is just trying to get by. We're not even bringing up the number of people who live below livable standards. I just brought up poverty. A livable wage is very different than a poverty wage. Half the planet hasn't gained wealth. They're basically just stuck in a poverty state. We have 8 billion people, and almost 4 billion of them are just stuck. And 1% out of 8 billion people, actually it's more than 8 billion, but I'm saying 8 billion to round. Out of all of those people, there's essentially 2,755 that we know of, billionaires, who have so much wealth that they don't have to ever, in their entire lifetime, worry about, for themselves or their family, basic human needs. Food, water, shelter, being able to learn and have an education, having health care, having protection, that none of that will ever be of concern to them. And so instead, They just accumulate wealth because it's become almost a game. It's become almost a way of, for some of them, like a coping method for their own trauma and therapy needs. They do it for a lot of reasons, but they don't need the money to survive in any way, shape, or form. They're completely and totally okay, while the other rest of the world isn't okay. 90% of the people on the planet aren't okay. Even people who aren't in extreme poverty are still struggling to get to a livable quality of life standard. And that's a huge issue. That's massive. For every $1 that someone in the bottom 90% of the human population earns, a billionaire is earning $1.7 billion if they're in the top 1%. 90% of human beings can't even manage to scrape together a dollar, and in the top 1%, 1.7 billion. I don't know how to express how much bigger a billion is than a million even. Millionaires are not rich anymore. I keep hearing people say, oh, I want to get to $1 million, but $1 million is not rich. $1 million is at least not in poverty. $1 million is above a livable wage, so at least there's that. But $1 million, if that's all you've got, you are not going to be able to live on that for the rest of your life. A billionaire could throw away 60% of all their money and still be incredibly rich. A multi-billionaire could throw away 90% of their money and still be incredibly rich. The other really big thing to understand is when someone says they want finances to be ethical, they're not saying you can't ever be rich. In reality, you can be a wealthy person and not necessarily be like a bad, evil person. The difference is the quality and standard of life. There's a huge wealth gap in some countries, and yet the quality of life and the standard of living for the poor are not so astronomically far away from the standard of living of the wealthy. And then you have the rest of the countries in the world, the majority of the countries in the world. We have a homelessness crisis going on and a loneliness crisis going on, healthcare crisis going on in the United States, but we're the richest country in the world. We have billionaires who have over 100 bill, and we have people who live in the streets. They could completely afford to just buy housing for every single American citizen, but they don't. Why would they? There's no reason for them to. They're not encouraged to do so. They're not frowned upon in a way that would actually be influential, and there's no regulations to force them to do something good. Literally, homelessness, starvation, should not even be a thing in this country, except that none of that money is being used. None of that money is being put toward helping anyone in a way that's significant. You'll have a corporation brag about donating $3 million to charity when their profit for the year was in the billions, when in actuality how much they donated to charity wasn't even 5% of how much they earned. It just sounds good because it sounds like millions. And millions is better than thousands, but most people are just struggling to exist. The majority of the planet should not be in a state of survival just so that a few people, less than 3,000 probably, but we don't actually know because billionaires can hide their wealth. We don't know exactly how many there are, but they get to live it up, never have to deal with any of the stress of actual life, of starvation, of housing, of their family being safe or not, never have to deal with any of the basic human needs or fears, while also robbing other people of the ability to avoid those things as well. And they do it by exploiting and consuming resources. They pillage the resources out of an area by convincing people that, oh, if a rich person goes and invests there, that'll bring wealth to the area. But in actuality, they're literally just taking every resource and then leaving. It's a very different thing. So am I trying to keep anyone who would be watching this video from getting rich? No, not in the least. You are so unlikely to ever become a multi-billionaire, let alone someone with $100 billion, that I'm not talking to you when I'm saying that I'm going to into financial ethics. Maybe you can't comprehend that. Maybe you don't want to believe that that's true. But in reality, most people who are poor won't ever become rich. They'll be lucky if they can get out of being poor and get into some sort of livable standard. Statistically, that's the truth. How did it get this way? Well, over the last 40 years, a lot of tax cuts have happened for the wealthiest, and there's some countries that flat out don't tax them at all. There's no inheritance taxes for them, or else very low ones. There's super low asset taxation, and in most countries there's pretty high product taxation, and the people consuming products are the poor, and the people holding on to assets are the rich. And so they don't really get taxed in the same rates. A multi-billionaire gets taxed at like a 3% tax rate, and a poor person, like in poverty, gets taxed at, even the poorest people in the United States get taxed at like 10%. So they're still getting taxed at a higher rate than a multi-billionaire is. The average American who's getting taxed at like, 30-40%. And so it's ridiculous to say, oh, don't put regulations on the multi-billionaires because someday I want to be rich. By all means, go get some money, that's fine. But the tax rate for them should absolutely be higher than 3%. And in some countries it is, but not here. If you are someone and you want to become, say, even 100 mil in net worth, I ain't talking to you. That's so poor. That's so completely povertous in comparison to 100 bill, that 100 mil is not worth me being concerned about. I don't care. Go get that money. You'll still be set up for life. Your family will still be set up for life. You won't have to deal with the struggles and the agonies that come from trying to survive and trying not to starve, trying to make sure you have a roof over your head. You won't have to deal with that crap. And yet you still will be in such a smaller earnable state at 100 mil than 100 billion that I just don't care. The people who have billions of dollars have so much more money that it is laughable to say that someone who gets, $1 million is wealthy. It's like a mockery. There is more wealth disparity currently than there was since like World War II. The wealth disparity in the world is like colonization levels. Like when people went out and colonized countries and pillaged all their resources and brought them back to their home countries, that's the kind of levels of disparity we're talking about here. And yet people think that by supporting the rich and worshiping the rich and wanting to be more like the rich, that they are somehow enhancing their own odds or chances of becoming them. And in reality, the odds of that happening are astronomically small. I am not in any way, shape, or form against someone gaining a few mil. If you want to become a millionaire, you want to get even to multi-millionaire status, okay, cool. But billionaires are a whole other level. It should not be that only a couple of people on the face of the planet hold the kind of wealth that they do. All of the money, period, in the world, half of the world's money is held by the top 10% richest people. All of the money on the whole face of the planet. So random people who walk up to me and say, oh no, you're trying to create barriers to me getting wealth by going into financial ethics. No, I'm not. I'm trying to actually make it more likely that you could. Almost no one gets to move forward in their wealth. There is a 1 to 2% growth rate for the majority of people on their wealth gain. Meanwhile, the wealthiest people, they gain wealth at like 14 to 23% of their income a year. And their income is already so huge. And a ton of their worth isn't even from their income. It's from being shareholders and holding wealth. There's 3 companies that basically hold 95% of all shares for the S&P 500. Like, the consolidation of wealth is just turning into hoarding. And these people who have this much money and this much power are not elected officials. They're not people who are respectable and going to go out and use that money to help other people and make the world a better place. They're not that kind of person. They're not elected. They're not voted for. They're just people who are super lucky and don't care. There are some billionaires who share wealth. I'm not saying it's 100% of all the richest people only hoard their wealth, because that's not true. But it is absolutely a problem, and the taxation on them is basically nothing. And you have to, at a certain point, recognize that it's not sustainable. It is not sustainable for billions of people on the face of the planet to be struggling to stay alive. And even right now, today, millions of people be starving just so that a few people can hoard trillions of dollars of wealth. It just doesn't make any logical, economical, psychological sense. And if you are someone who wants to be wealthy, you want to have that comfortable life, I'm not talking to you. That is an okay thing to dream about. That is even an admirable thing to want for your family to be safe, to have health care, to be okay. But the truth of the matter is it's not little people who are not earning tons of money who are keeping you from getting there. The people who are actually keeping you from getting there are the very people that you admire.